The gunshot split the evening air as Grace Harper clutched her swollen belly, doubling over in pain on the dusty trail to Silverstone Creek. It wasn't the bullet that caused her agony. It had whistled harmlessly past her ear, but something far more terrifying. Her baby was coming nearly 2 months before its time, and she was alone in the wilderness with the sun rapidly sinking toward the horizon. Wyoming Territory, 1878. Grace had been on her way to the nearest town after fleeing the homestead she'd shared with her late husband. Samuel Harper had been dead 3 months now, victim of a raid by cattle rustlers who'd found little worth stealing from their modest farm. The pregnancy had been her secret joy, her final gift from Samuel, and now, as contractions ripped through her body, she feared she might lose this precious connection to him too. "Help!" she cried out, though she knew the wilderness wouldn't answer. The gunshot had likely come from a hunter, someone too distant to hear her pleas. Grace collapsed against a large boulder, her breath coming in ragged gasps as another contraction seized her. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her head snap up. Friend or foe, she couldn't tell, but in her current state, she had little choice but to hope for mercy. A rider appeared over the ridge, silhouetted against the burning orange sky. He pulled his horse to a stop when he spotted her. "Madam." The rider dismounted with fluid grace, approaching cautiously. "Are you hurt?" His voice was deep but gentle, with a slight southern drawl that seemed out of place in Wyoming Territory. "The baby," Grace managed through gritted teeth. "It's coming too soon." The stranger knelt beside her, pushing back his hat to reveal a weathered face framed by dark hair. His eyes, a startling shade of blue, widened as he assessed her situation. "I'm Vincent Ingram," he said, already shrugging off his coat. "Most folks call me Vince. I've got a cabin not far from here." "Grace," she gasped. "Grace Harper, I don't think I can." Another contraction cut her words short, more intense than the last. "We need to get you somewhere safe," Vince said, his expression grave as he glanced at the darkening sky. "Can you ride?" Grace shook her head, tears flowing freely now. "The baby's coming now, I can feel it." Vince's jaw tightened as he made a quick decision. "Then we'll do this here." He spread his coat on the ground. "I've helped birth calves and foals before. It's not the same, I know, but the principles aren't so different." "You're a rancher?" Grace asked, desperate for anything to distract from the pain. "Cowboy," he corrected, helping her onto the makeshift bed. "Work for the Double Cross Ranch, but I've got my own little place too." He rummaged through his saddlebags, producing a canteen and a clean bandana. "Not much, but it'll have to do." The labor progressed with frightening speed. Perhaps it was because the baby was early, or perhaps her body had been preparing without her knowledge, but within an hour, Grace was pushing with all her might under Vince's surprisingly capable guidance. "That's it," he encouraged, his voice steady despite the extraordinary circumstances. "I can see the head. One more big push, Grace." With a final, agonizing effort, Grace felt her child slip into the world and the strangest silence fell. No cry. No sound at all except her own ragged breathing and the soft wind through the pines. "He's so small," Vince whispered, cradling the tiny, still form in his large hands. The baby was indeed tiny, with translucent skin and limbs no bigger than Vince's fingers. "Is he?" Grace couldn't finish the question, fear clutching at her heart. Then, as if responding to her voice, the infant gave the weakest of coughs, followed by a thin, reedy cry. "He's alive," Vince confirmed, his voice thick with emotion, "but he's fighting hard." He wrapped the baby in his bandana, then carefully handed the tiny bundle to Grace. The infant's face was pinched and red, his breathing labored. He was so small, so fragile, and already Grace could see he was struggling in the cooling night air. "He's too cold," she said, panic rising in her voice. "He needs to be warm." Vince didn't hesitate. He sat beside her, his body shielding them both from the wind, and wrapped his arms around Grace and the baby. "We'll keep him warm together," he said with quiet determination. "Body heat's the best thing for him right now." Grace looked up at this stranger, this cowboy who had appeared out of nowhere when she needed help most, and saw nothing but kindness and resolve in his eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, leaning against his solid warmth. "What will you call him?" Vince asked softly, looking down at the tiny face. Grace hadn't thought that far ahead. She'd been so focused on reaching town, on finding a safe place to have her baby. Now, looking at her son's struggle to survive his first moments in this harsh world, she knew exactly what to name him. Samuel, she said, honoring her husband. Samuel Thomas Harper, but if he lives through this night, I'll call him Thomas for my father. He was a fighter too. He'll make it, Vince said with conviction. He's got a strong mother, and that counts for a lot in this world. As night fully descended upon them, Vince built a small fire, never moving far from Grace and the infant. He brought his horse closer, creating a windbreak, and fashioned a more comfortable bed from his bedroll and saddle blanket. All the while, he kept checking on the baby, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as they monitored the child's faint pulse and struggled breathing. "First light, we'll head to my cabin," he explained, settling back beside them. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry. Got a proper stove, too." "Why are you doing this?" Grace asked, exhaustion making her blunt. "You don't know me." Vince was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "My sister died in childbirth 3 years back," he finally said, "out in these parts without proper help. Her husband was away and she was alone." His voice grew rough. "By the time I found her, it was too late for both her and the baby." Grace's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry," he nodded once sharply. "So am I, but maybe this is a chance to make something right in the world. I couldn't help her, but I can help you and your son." Through the night, they took turns holding Thomas close to their bodies for warmth. When Grace's arms grew too tired, Vince would gently take the baby, tucking him inside his shirt against his bare chest. For hours, they fought against the cold and the odds, watching over the tiny life that seemed to hang by a thread. "Tell me about your husband," Vince said during one of these exchanges, perhaps sensing she needed to talk to stay awake. "Samuel was kind," Grace said, her voice soft with memory. "Not a grand man or particularly ambitious, but decent and hardworking. We came west from Pennsylvania 3 years ago. He wanted land of his own." She looked down at her hands. "The farm never really flourished, the soil was poorer than we expected, and then the rustlers came." "I heard about that raid," Vince said grimly. "Double Cross lost some cattle too, bunch of cowards attacking homesteaders." "They didn't find much worth taking," Grace continued, "but Samuel confronted them. He had a shotgun." She trailed off, the memory still too painful. "I was in the root cellar. He'd hidden me there when we heard riders coming. By the time I dared come out, they were gone and he was." She couldn't finish. Vince reached out with his free hand and gripped her shoulder firmly. "You've got grit, Grace Harper. Most women would have headed back east after something like that." "I had nowhere to go," she admitted. "And then when I realized I was carrying Samuel's child, I knew I had to make a life here somehow. I was on my way to Silverstone Creek to find work when the labor started." The baby made a soft, distressed sound, and instantly both adults focused on him. His breathing seemed more labored, his tiny body shivering despite the warmth they provided. "He's struggling," Grace whispered, fear evident in her voice. Vince unwrapped the bandana slightly, examining the infant with careful eyes. "His color's not good. He needs to be stronger to fight." He thought for a moment, then said, "I've seen this with calves born in winter. Sometimes they need more than just warmth." He reached for his saddlebag again and pulled out a small flask. Grace's eyes widened. "Not for drinking," he assured her with a slight smile. "It's honey water. Cowboys carry it for energy on long rides." He dipped his little finger into the flask, coating it with the sweet liquid, then carefully placed it against the baby's mouth. "Come on, little man," he coaxed. To Grace's amazement, Thomas's tiny lips moved slightly, his tongue instinctively seeking the sustenance. It was just a drop, but it seemed to revive him somewhat. "That's it," Vince encouraged. "He's got fight in him, like you said." For the remainder of the night, they continued this routine, keeping the baby warm between them, offering tiny drops of honey water when he seemed to weaken. By dawn, Thomas was still alive, his breathing slightly steadier. Though he remained frighteningly fragile, true to his word, Vince helped Grace onto his horse at first light, fashioning a sling from his bandana so the baby could be secured against her chest. He led the horse on foot, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid jostling the precious cargo. Vince's cabin appeared after about an hour's journey, a modest structure nestled against a stand of pines, with a small corral and lean-to stable beside it. It wasn't large or grand, but Grace could immediately see it had been built with care and attention to detail. "It's not much," Vince said, echoing his words from the night before as he helped her dismount, "but it's solid." Inside, the cabin was simple but clean, consisting of a main room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. A curtain partially concealed what appeared to be a storage area. Vince immediately set about building a fire in the stove, then filled a kettle with water from a bucket by the door. "You take the bed," he said, not looking at her as he worked. "I'll sleep on my bedroll by the fire." Grace was too exhausted to argue. The events of the previous day and night had drained her completely. Once the fire was blazing and the cabin began to warm, she settled onto the bed with Thomas still cradled against her chest. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Vince finally turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "No need, just rest now, both of you." Grace slipped into an exhausted sleep, waking periodically to check on Thomas. Each time she opened her eyes, she found Vince alert and watching over them, tending the fire or preparing simple food. By midday, she felt strong enough to sit up properly, though every muscle in her body protested the movement. "How is he?" Vince asked, bringing her a cup of strong tea sweetened with honey. Grace examined her son in the daylight. He was still alarmingly small, his skin nearly translucent, but his breathing seemed more regular. "Still fighting," she said, "but I'm worried about feeding him. My milk hasn't come in yet." Vince nodded, clearly having considered this problem. "There's a widow about 2 miles from here, Mrs. Edmund. Her baby's about 4 months old. I can ride over and see if she might help." "You do that?" Grace asked, touched by his continued kindness. "Course," he said simply, already reaching for his hat. "You'll be all right here for a bit. There's jerky and biscuits in that tin by the stove if you get hungry." After he left, Grace took the opportunity to truly look around the cabin. Despite its simplicity, there were touches that spoke of care shelves made of polished wood holding a few books, a hand-carved chest set on a small table by the window, and surprisingly intricate curtains that she suspected hadn't been made by Vince himself. On the mantel above the fireplace, she noticed a small framed photograph, a young woman with Vince's same startling blue eyes, smiling beside a serious-looking man. His sister and her husband, Grace guessed, feeling a renewed pang of sadness for his loss. Vince returned faster than she expected, accompanied by a stout, cheerful woman carrying a healthy infant on her hip. "Mrs. Harper, this is Martha Edmund," Vince introduced. "She's agreed to help." Martha handed her baby to Vince without ceremony and bustled over to Grace, her expression softening as she saw Thomas. "Lord have mercy, he is a tiny one," she said, her voice gentle despite her brisk manner. "But I've seen smaller make it through with proper care." She sat beside Grace on the bed. "Now, I can nurse him today and show you how to express milk for him until yours comes in. I'll come back tomorrow too, but after that, I've got my farm to tend." "I can't thank you enough," Grace said, carefully handing Thomas to the woman. Martha expertly positioned the infant at her breast. "No need for thanks. We all help each other out here. Vince saved my Joshua from pneumonia last winter, sitting up with him 3 nights straight when I was too exhausted to stay awake." Grace glanced at Vince, who was awkwardly bouncing Martha's baby boy while studiously avoiding looking toward the bed where Martha was nursing. There was clearly more to this taciturn cowboy than she'd initially thought. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Martha came each morning to nurse Thomas and check on his progress, bringing supplies and advice. Grace's own milk came in on the 3rd day, bringing both relief and pain as her body adjusted to its new purpose. Vince proved to be a respectful and considerate host, giving Grace privacy when needed but remaining attentive to their needs. He fashioned a crude cradle from a wooden box, lining it with soft fabric that Martha had brought. At night, he insisted on keeping the fire well stoked, sometimes staying awake to ensure the temperature remained constant for the fragile infant. By the end of the first week, Thomas had gained a small amount of weight and his color had improved marginally. He was still dangerously small, but Grace allowed herself to hope that he might survive. "He's a determined little fellow," Vince observed one evening as they sat by the fire, Thomas sleeping in his makeshift cradle between them. "Takes after his mother that way, I reckon." Grace smiled, the first genuine smile since Samuel's death. "I wasn't always so determined. Back in Pennsylvania, I was actually known for being quite indecisive. Samuel used to tease me about it." She looked into the flames. "Losing him changed me, had to change me." Vince nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Loss does that, reshapes you." "What about you?" Grace asked, curious about this man who had become her unexpected guardian. "Have you always been a cowboy?" A slight smile crossed his face. "More or less. My father ran a small outfit in Texas. Learned to ride before I could walk properly, according to family legend." He poked at the fire with a stick. "Came north after the war, didn't feel right in Texas anymore." "You fought," he nodded once. "Confederate side, not by choice exactly, just where I happened to be born. Didn't believe in the cause, but I believed in protecting my home and family." His expression grew distant. "Saw too much, did too much, needed the wide open afterward." Grace understood. The war had touched everyone in some way, even those like her who had been children when it ended. "The scars it left weren't always visible, and your sister followed you north?" she asked gently. "Few years later, she married a man who wanted to try ranching up here." His jaw tightened. "Should have insisted they stay closer to town, should have checked on them more often." "You couldn't have known," Grace said softly. Vince didn't respond, but his expression said he'd never forgiven himself for what happened to his sister. As the days passed, Grace began to worry about imposing on Vince's hospitality. "I should think about moving on to Silverstone Creek soon," she mentioned one morning as they shared a breakfast of oatmeal. "Once Thomas is stronger." Vince's hand stilled, spoon halfway to his mouth. "There's no rush," he said carefully. "The weather's turning colder. Not good traveling conditions for a newborn." "But I can't stay here indefinitely," Grace insisted. "You've been more than kind, but this is your home, and I need to find work, make a life for Thomas and myself." Vince set down his spoon, considering his words. "What kind of work were you hoping to find?" "I'm a decent seamstress, or I could work in a boarding house perhaps. I'm not afraid of hard work." "And who would look after Thomas while you worked?" Grace hadn't thought that far ahead. The reality of being a widowed mother was still sinking in. I'm not sure," she admitted. Vince cleared his throat. "I've been thinking. Winter's coming on hard and the double cross won't need as many hands. I'd planned to spend more time here fixing up the place." He gestured around the cabin. "Could use some help with that, the cooking and such too." Grace stared at him, unsure what he was suggesting. "What I mean to say," he continued, looking uncomfortable, "is that you could stay on here. Help with the domestic matters. I'll provide for you and Thomas, at least until spring when he's stronger and the weather's better for traveling." "You mean, as your housekeeper?" Grace clarified. Vince nodded, seeming relieved that she understood. "Exactly. It would help us both. You'd have a safe place for winter and I'd have decent meals for a change." He attempted a smile. "I'm a terrible cook." It was a practical arrangement, and Grace couldn't deny it made sense. Thomas was still far too fragile for travel, and the prospect of arriving in a strange town with a newborn and no immediate prospects was daunting. "All right," she agreed, "until spring." The arrangement quickly settled into a comfortable routine. Grace took over the running of the small household, cooking meals, mending Vince's clothes, and keeping the cabin clean while caring for Thomas. Vince worked on improvements to the cabin and tended to his small herd of cattle and 2 horses. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes in companionable silence. Grace found herself looking forward to these quiet moments when Vince would occasionally read aloud from one of his books or teach her the rules of chess. Thomas grew stronger by the day. Though still small for his age, he began to show more vigor, his cries becoming more demanding, his grip on Grace's finger more determined. Each small improvement was celebrated between them as if the child's progress was a shared victory. As November deepened toward December, the first heavy snow blanketed the landscape. Vince had prepared well, storing firewood under a lean-to and smoking meat to last through the winter. The cabin, once merely functional, had become cozy under Grace's influence. She had rearranged the furniture for better use of space and added small touches wildflowers in a jar before they withered in the cold, pine boughs for their fresh scent, and curtains she'd sewn from fabric Martha had brought. One evening, as a particularly fierce snowstorm raged outside, Vince returned from checking on the livestock with frost clinging to his beard and a troubled expression. "Everything all right?" Grace asked, looking up from where she sat nursing Thomas. Vince stomped the snow from his boots before answering. "Storm's bad, worst I've seen this early in the season." He hung his coat by the door, brought the horses into the lean-to. "They'll be warmer there." Grace could see he was worried about more than just the horses. "What is it?" He ran a hand through his hair, hesitating before speaking. "If this keeps up, we could be snowed in for a while. Trails to town might be impassable for weeks." "We have enough supplies, don't we?" Grace asked, concerned. "Food, yes, but I'm worried about medicine, if either of you gets sick." He didn't finish the thought, but Grace understood. Thomas was still vulnerable, and medical help would be a long way off. "We'll be careful," she assured him. "And Martha taught me about using pine needle tea for coughs and willow bark for fever." Vince nodded, but the worry didn't leave his eyes. He crossed to the fire and held out his hands to the flames, his back to her. "I keep thinking about Jenny, my sister. It was winter when she died. A simple fever at first, then it worsened." His shoulders were tense. By the time her husband got back from getting medicine, it was too late. Grace adjusted Thomas in her arms and rose, moving to stand beside Vince. "We're not alone like she was," she said softly. "We have each other." Vince turned to look at her, something unreadable in his expression. For a moment, they stood close enough that Grace could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Something shifted between them, a recognition of how their lives had become intertwined beyond the practical arrangement they'd agreed to. The moment was broken when Thomas made a small sound, drawing Grace's attention back to her son. Vince stepped away, clearing his throat. "I should get supper started," Grace said, suddenly aware of the domestic intimacy of their situation. "I'll help," Vince offered, already moving toward the small pantry area. That night, as the wind howled around the cabin, Grace lay awake in the bed that Vince had insisted she continue to use while he slept on a pallet near the fire. She listened to his steady breathing across the room and realized with a start that she had come to depend on his presence, to find comfort in it. It had been nearly 3 months since Samuel's death, and while the grief hadn't disappeared, it had changed form. She would always mourn him, would always ensure Thomas knew about his father. But the sharp pain of loss had gradually been replaced by something different, a determination to build a new life, whatever form it might take. The storm lasted 3 days, leaving them truly isolated in a landscape transformed by snow. When it finally cleared, the sun reflecting off the white expanse was almost blinding. Vince spent hours clearing paths to the stable and digging out the door, while Grace watched from the window with Thomas in her arms. "He's smiling," she called out suddenly, as Vince passed by the window with a shovel over his shoulder. Vince hurried inside, snow still clinging to his coat, to see the tiny upturn of Thomas's lips. It wasn't a full smile, just the barest suggestion of one, but it was unmistakable. "Well, look at that," Vince said softly, moving closer to see. "He knows his mama." "I think he's smiling at you," Grace countered, noticing how Thomas's eyes tracked Vince's movement. "He recognizes your voice." A strange expression crossed Vince's face, pride mingled with something deeper. He reached out tentatively, and Grace placed Thomas in his arms without hesitation. The baby looked tiny against Vince's broad chest, but there was nothing awkward about the way the cowboy held him. In fact, there was a natural ease between them that tugged at Grace's heart. "Hello there, Thomas," Vince said, his voice gentle in a way Grace only heard when he spoke to the baby. "Getting stronger every day, aren't you?" As if in response, Thomas made a soft cooing sound, his eyes fixed on Vince's face. "He knows who's been looking out for him," Grace said. Children sense these things. Vince glanced up at her, a vulnerability in his expression that she rarely saw. Never thought I'd hold a baby again after Jenny's died, he admitted quietly. Hurts too much, usually. And now, Grace asked. He looked back down at Thomas, his expression softening. Now it feels right somehow. He carefully handed the baby back to Grace, their hands briefly touching in the exchange. Better get back to shoveling, need to check on the cattle too. As December progressed, the isolation of their situation became more apparent. Their only visitor was Martha, who braved the snow every few days to check on them and bring news from the scattered community. It was from her that they learned of an influenza outbreak in Silverstone Creek. 3 dead already, Martha reported grimly during one visit. Doctors overwhelmed. Says to stay away from town if you can. Grace clutched Thomas closer, fear gripping her heart. Is it spreading this way? Martha shook her head. Not yet. But that's why I haven't brought Joshua today, keeping him home just in case. Vince's expression grew serious. We'll stay put. Got enough supplies to last the winter if needed. After Martha left, Grace found herself unconsciously checking Thomas's forehead for fever throughout the day. Vince noticed her concern and quietly brought in more firewood, ensuring the cabin remained warm. We'll keep him safe, he assured her that night as they sat by the fire. He's getting stronger every day. I know, Grace said, though worry still gnawed at her. It's just, I can't lose him too. Vince surprised her by reaching across and taking her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, but his touch was gentle. You won't, we've come too far. The word hung in the air between them. Somewhere along the way, Thomas's welfare had become their shared concern, his milestones their shared joy. Grace looked down at their joined hands, aware that the boundaries of their arrangement had blurred into something neither of them had anticipated. Christmas approached, bringing with it a kind of wistful atmosphere to the cabin. Grace had never spent the holiday away from family before, and thoughts of past celebrations with her parents and siblings, and then with Samuel, brought both sweet memories and sharp pangs of loss. Vince seemed to sense her melancholy. Used to be a big day in your family. He asked one evening as they prepared for bed. Grace nodded, tucking a blanket around Thomas in his cradle. My mother would spend weeks baking and decorating. All the neighbors would visit. She smiled at the memory. What about you? Vince shrugged, banking the fire for the night. Not much for celebrations in my family. Pa wasn't the sentimental type. And after you came north, usually worked. Someone has to watch the herds, even on Christmas. He paused, then added, but Jenny always insisted I come for dinner when I could. She made a good plum pudding. There was that sadness again, the grief he carried for his sister. Grace made a decision then, wanting to ease that burden somehow. The next day, while Vince was out checking his trap lines, she began secretly working on small gifts, a new shirt sewn from fabric she found in Martha's latest bundle of supplies, and a small wooden horse she whittled for Thomas, though he was too young to appreciate it. Christmas Eve arrived with unexpected clarity, the sky a brilliant blue above the snow-covered landscape. Vince returned from his morning chores with a small pine tree slung over his shoulder. Thought we might want this, he said gruffly, as if embarrassed by the gesture. Grace's face lit up. It's perfect. Together, they set up the tree in a corner of the cabin. Grace fashioned ornaments from scraps of fabric and paper, while Vince contributed pine cones and a star he'd whittled from a piece of wood. The simple decorations transformed the humble tree into something magical, especially when Vince placed the few candles they could spare among the branches and lit them. That night, they shared a special meal, rabbit stew enriched with the last of their dried vegetables, and biscuits made with precious sugar Grace had been saving. After they ate, Vince surprised her by producing a small package wrapped in brown paper. For Thomas, he said, pushing it across the table toward her. Grace unwrapped it to find a tiny pair of leather moccasins, beautifully made with soft deerskin. Vince, these are exquisite, she breathed. Did you make them? He nodded, looking pleased but self-conscious. Learned leatherwork from an old trapper years back. Thought the boy should have proper boots when he starts walking. When he starts walking, Grace repeated, touched by Vince's assumption that Thomas would grow into a healthy child who would one day need shoes. That's the best gift you could have given me, that confidence. Vince's cheeks reddened slightly. Just practical thinking, he demurred. Well, I have something for you too, Grace said, retrieving the shirt she'd hidden away. It's not much. Vince unfolded the garment, running his fingers over the neat stitching. It was a simple work shirt, but Grace had added small details, double stitching at the stress points, a reinforced collar, and his initials discreetly embroidered on the cuff. No one's made me clothes since Jenny, he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. Thank you. Grace wasn't prepared for what happened next. Vince leaned across the table and kissed her cheek, a brief, gentle touch that sent warmth spreading through her entire body. When he pulled back, his eyes reflected the candlelight, and something else, a question, perhaps, or a hope. Before either could speak, Thomas began to cry, the moment suspended between them as Grace went to tend to her son. By the time she returned, Vince had composed himself, though a certain tension remained in the air. He's growing, Vince observed as Grace settled back at the table with Thomas in her arms, filling out some. Yes, Grace agreed, grateful for the safe topic. Martha says he's catching up to where he should be. His lungs are stronger too. Have you noticed his cries are louder? Vince smiled. Hard not to notice at 3 a.m. They both laughed, the momentary awkwardness fading. As they continued their modest celebration, Grace found herself watching Vince, seeing him with new eyes. He was no longer just her benefactor or the kind stranger who had helped deliver her son. He was becoming something else, something more significant in her life. And that realization was both thrilling and terrifying. January brought the coldest weather of the winter, with temperatures so low that frost formed on the inside of the cabin windows, despite the constantly burning fire. They developed strategies to conserve heat, hanging blankets to partition the sleeping areas, heating stones in the fire to place in the bed, and keeping Thomas's cradle near the stove during the day. During one particularly bitter night, Grace woke to find Thomas fussing and clearly uncomfortable despite his swaddling. The fire had burned lower than usual, and the cabin had a distinct chill. "What's wrong, little one?" she murmured, lifting him from his cradle. His skin felt cool to the touch, concerning her immediately. Vince stirred from his pallet, instantly alert. "Everything all right?" "He's too cold," Grace said, worry evident in her voice. The fires died down more than usual. Vince was on his feet immediately, adding wood to the stove and stoking it back to life. "Bring him here," he said, sitting on the edge of Grace's bed. "Body heat will warm him faster than the fire." Grace sat beside him, and Vince wrapped his arm around her shoulders, creating a cocoon of warmth around the three of them. Thomas, nestled between them, gradually stopped fussing as their combined body heat enveloped him. "Better?" Vince asked softly. Grace nodded, acutely aware of his proximity, of the solid strength of his arm around her. They stayed that way until Thomas drifted back to sleep, neither wanting to disturb the peaceful moment or, perhaps, to break the connection that had formed between them. When Grace finally moved to place Thomas back in his cradle, she hesitated, then turned back to Vince. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, not just tonight, but all of it." The firelight cast shadows across his face, highlighting the strong lines of his jaw and the kindness in his eyes. "You don't need to thank me," he replied. "Having you both here, it's been good for me." Grace took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I've been thinking about spring." Vince's body tensed slightly, though his expression remained neutral. "About moving on to Silverstone Creek." "About not moving on," Grace corrected softly, "if that's something you might want." For a long moment, Vince was silent, and Grace feared she had misread the situation entirely. Then he reached out, gently touching her cheek. "I'd like that very much," he said, his voice low and sincere. "But I need you to be sure, your husband hasn't been gone a year yet. Samuel would want me and Thomas to be happy, to be safe," Grace said with quiet certainty. "I didn't expect to find that again so soon, and certainly not like this, but life out here doesn't wait for proper mourning periods." Vince nodded, understanding in his eyes. "We could take it slow, see how things stand when spring comes." It was a sensible approach, typical of his careful nature. Grace appreciated his restraint, his respect for her grief and for the conventional proprieties, even as they lived in this unconventional situation. "That sounds wise," she agreed, though part of her already knew what her decision would be when the time came. February brought a gradual warming, with occasional days of brilliant sunshine that melted the top layer of snow before it froze again at night. Thomas continued to thrive, growing more alert and responsive each day. He had developed a particular fondness for Vince, often calming immediately when the cowboy's deep voice filled the cabin. One afternoon, as they sat together while Thomas napped, Vince brought up a subject they had danced around for weeks. "Been thinking about the future," he began, uncharacteristically hesitant. "About the spring like we discussed." Grace set aside her mending, giving him her full attention. "Yes, this place could be better," he continued, gesturing around the cabin. "Could add another room, maybe. Proper bedroom, fix up the barn too, for more cattle," Grace asked, though she suspected that wasn't his primary concern. Vince met her eyes directly. "For a family, if you wanted that, you and Thomas," Grace's heart quickened. "Are you asking what I think you're asking, Vincent Ingram?" He smiled, the rare full smile that transformed his weathered face. "Reckon I am, though not very well." He moved from his chair to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his. "I love that boy like he was my own, and I've grown to love his mother too, more than I thought possible." Tears sprang to Grace's eyes. "Vince, I know it hasn't been long," he continued earnestly. "And I know I'm not the man you planned on spending your life with, but I'd be good to you both. I'd work hard to give you a good life." Grace squeezed his hands. "You already have," she said softly. "You gave us life itself that night on the trail. Everything since has just confirmed what kind of man you are." "Is that a yes?" Vince asked, hope evident in his voice. "It's a yes," Grace confirmed, her heart full. "Thomas and I would be honored to become your family." The kiss they shared was gentle at first, tentative with the newness of it, then deepening with the emotion they'd both held in check for so long. When they finally parted, Vince rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. "Never thought I'd find this," he murmured. After everything, after the war, after Jenny, Grace understood. She too had believed her chance at happiness had died with Samuel. Life has strange ways of bringing us what we need, even when we're not looking for it. Thomas chose that moment to wake, his cries pulling them back to the present reality. They shared a laugh as they separated, Vince rising to his feet while Grace went to the cradle. "Timing, son," Vince said with a chuckle as Grace brought the baby back to where he stood. "We'll have to work on that, son." The word hung in the air, significant and right. Thomas would know about Samuel, would hear stories of the father who had died before his birth, but he would also have Vince steady, kind Vince who had been there from his first breath. "When should we marry?" Grace asked practically as she settled in the chair with Thomas. Vince considered. "Need to wait for better weather to get to town. April maybe, unless you'd prefer to wait longer." Grace shook her head. "April would be fine. Martha mentioned there's a circuit preacher who comes through Silverstone Creek around then." They spent the remainder of February and March planning their future together. Vince began working on expanding the cabin whenever the weather permitted, adding a proper bedroom with a window facing the east. Grace sewed curtains and pieced together quilts from fabric Martha brought, along with her congratulations when they shared their news. "Knew it the moment I saw you two together," Martha declared with satisfaction. "Just like I told my Joshua, those two are meant to be a family." As the snow began to melt in earnest, revealing patches of brown earth and the first green shoots of spring, Vince rode to Silverstone Creek to make arrangements with the preacher and to purchase supplies. He returned with not only the necessities, but also a simple gold band for Grace and a small silver rattle for Thomas. "Wedding present for the boy," he explained as Thomas grasped the rattle with unexpected strength, his eyes wide at the new toy. Figure he should have something to mark the occasion, too. The day of their wedding dawned clear and warm, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and new growth. Martha had helped Grace remake one of her dresses, adding lace she'd been saving and fashioning a simple bouquet from the first wildflowers of spring. Vince wore his best shirt, the one Grace had made him for Christmas, with a newly purchased vest and his freshly polished boots. The ceremony took place in front of their cabin, with Thomas contentedly cradled in Martha's arms while her husband Joshua stood as witness. The preacher, a kind-faced older man named Reverend Wilson, spoke of new beginnings and God's blessings on unions built on mutual respect and care. When it came time for their vows, Vince surprised Grace with words he'd clearly prepared in advance. "Grace, I promise to be a true and faithful husband to you and a loving father to Thomas. I'll work every day to be worthy of the trust you've placed in me. We started our journey together in difficult circumstances, but I believe that was God's hand at work, bringing us together when we needed each other most. I'll keep you both warm and safe for all the days we have together." Grace, touched by his heartfelt words, responded with equal sincerity. "Vince, you came into our lives when all seemed lost, and you brought hope back to me. You've shown me what strength truly is, not just in body, but in character and in heart. I promise to be a loving wife to you, to create a home filled with warmth and joy, and to walk beside you through whatever life brings our way. Thomas and I are blessed to call you ours." The simple gold band slid onto her finger, replacing the one from Samuel that now hung on a chain around her neck, a memory honored but not forgotten as she embraced her new future. After the ceremony, they shared a celebratory meal with the small group of guests, Martha and Joshua, a few neighbors who had weathered the winter within riding distance, and 2 cowboys from the Double Cross who had worked with Vince. There was music from a fiddle one of the cowboys produced, dancing on the packed earth in front of the cabin, and laughter that seemed to chase away the last vestiges of the long winter. As evening fell, their guests departed, leaving the new family alone together. Vince stood on the porch, his arm around Grace's waist as they watched the last wagon disappear down the trail. Thomas was asleep in his cradle inside, exhausted from the excitement of the day. "Happy?" Vince asked, looking down at her with tenderness. Grace nodded, leaning into his embrace. "Very. And grateful for everything that brought us to this moment, even the hardest parts." Vince's arm tightened around her. "I keep thinking about that night on the trail, how close we came to losing him, to losing everything before it began. But we didn't," Grace reminded him. "We kept him warm together, just like you said we would, and now we'll keep each other warm for all the days to come." Vince turned to face her fully, framing her face with his hands. "I love you, Grace Ingram," he said, the new name sounding right and natural on his lips. "And I love you, Vincent Ingram," she replied, rising on tiptoes to meet his kiss. Inside, Thomas slept peacefully, no longer the fragile infant fighting for every breath, but a growing boy with strength in his limbs and color in his cheeks. Outside, the stars emerged in a clear spring sky, shining down on the cabin where a family born of chance and nurtured by love had found their place in the vast wilderness of the Wyoming Territory. 5 years later, the cabin had expanded into a proper ranch house, with 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. The barn housed not only cattle, but also a small dairy operation that Grace had started, selling butter and cheese to the growing town of Silverstone Creek. Thomas, now a robust 5-year-old with Grace's dark curls and a temperament that matched Vince's steady nature, chased his 3-year-old sister Emma across the yard. Behind them toddled 1-year-old Samuel, named for the father Thomas would never know but whose memory was honored in their home. Grace stood in the doorway, watching her children play while Vince taught Thomas how to throw a lasso, the rope comically oversized in the boy's small hands. Her heart swelled with contentment and gratitude for the life they had built together. "Look, Ma." Thomas called out as he managed to loop the rope around a fence post. "I did it." "Well done," Grace called back, laughing at his excited dance of victory. Vince caught her eye across the yard, his smile still having the power to warm her from within. In that moment, Grace remembered the frightened, grieving widow she had been on that dusty trail and marveled at how far they had come. From a night of desperation and a baby born too soon, they had forged a family and a home filled with love. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the one she was meant to have, a truth as clear as the Wyoming sky above them and as enduring as the love that had begun with a cowboy's simple promise. "We'll keep him warm together."